Are you ready to go from just studying Spanish to start speaking Spanish with confidence? Do you feel left out when you hear people chatting away in Spanish around you, but you can't keep up with the conversation? Well, I'll let you in on the number one secret that will help you start speaking Spanish with confidence way sooner than you think. You'll find out how to easily master Spanish conversations whenever you meet someone for the first time. The quick guide to your first Spanish conversation will prepare you to start a conversation with any Spanish speaker because you'll know exactly what to say. When you download your free guide to your first Spanish conversation, you'll learn the 8 key questions you need to know to have a conversation in Spanish with anyone. You'll also learn 29 natural sounding responses to the most common conversation questions so you can answer like a native Spanish speaker and not a textbook parrot. We'll give you the exact steps to prepare for a conversation with anyone in Spanish, and you can learn this in just 30 minutes. Go to SpanishConversationGuide.com for your free guide to your first Spanish conversation. That's SpanishConversationGuide.com. Now let's get started with the episode.
Bienvenidos.
Bienvenidos.
Welcome to the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast.
Here's your host,
Certified Language Coach,
Tamara Marie.
Hola, bienvenidos al otro episodio del podcast Learn Spanish con Salsa. Welcome to another episode of the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast. I am your host, Tamara Marie, and on this episode of the podcast, I am super excited to bring a conversation with one of the members of our Spanish con Salsa community, who's going to share her experience learning Spanish over several decades. She's going to talk about everything that she tried, from going to school for Spanish to doing immersion trips, and how after all of that, she still struggled with her confidence in speaking the language. And I think that this is a really important conversation to listen to if you are someone who has been learning Spanish maybe off and on. Maybe you've been, having times where you're making progress, but then you find yourself stuck or demotivated for some reason. That time when you tried to jump into a Spanish conversation and you didn't understand what was going on and you just kind of gave up because you were kind of like, maybe I'm not good at languages, or maybe this isn't for me, or maybe this is just too hard, or I'm doing something wrong. So if you've ever struggled with that in your journey to fluency, which you are definitely still on, because if you're listening to this podcast, I know that you have a burning desire to speak Spanish fluently, and it's something that is important to you. And today's conversation, I think, will really show you that perseverance is going to be your best friend if you want to get fluent in Spanish, but also finding an approach that will work for you. So Cynthia is going to share with you her journey to Spanish fluency, and I promise you, you have not had as many obstacles as she's had, and as many things that have probably come into your way in the time that you've been learning that could have really caused you to quit. And something that I think is really key in our conversation is finding out what works for you, but also knowing when to switch gears and try something different, and also when to not give up. So if you've ever felt like, maybe I'll just be okay with Spanish, but I'm never going to really speak it well, or I'm just learning right now, I'm not ready to speak, I hope that you will listen to Cynthia's story, because it will definitely get you to think a little bit differently about your approach. So without any further delay, here is my conversation with Cynthia Abejuro. Hi, Cynthia. Welcome to the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And I appreciate you taking the time to join me to share your story, because I know you have been one of our star members of our Spanish Fluency Club, which is our membership community where we are learning Spanish, but more in a group setting, and also getting coaching and support through that process. So could you first talk a little bit about what sparked your interest in learning Spanish in the first place, and what is it that made you want to become fluent in Spanish?
Oh, I have a very personal reason for doing that. My mother's family is from Cuba. My mother was adopted as a child into a family that wasn't Spanish speaking, but interestingly enough, she maintained contact with her biological family. So my abuela would be calling on the phone, and she would, of course, have me count and tell her the colors in Spanish. But that was about the extent of the Spanish learning experience that I got. But I've always been someone that really was fascinated by other languages and other cultures. And I had a burning desire since I was really a very young child to be fluent, especially after seeing my cousins speak Spanish so easily. So that was my spark.
Okay. And what was it that made you go from just this desire of like, it would really be nice if I could communicate more in Spanish to actually starting that process of learning the language?
Well, I think it's my personality. I've been called at work the bulldog. And once I start on something, I don't let it go. And that's been since I was a little girl. My mother said that tenacity was my best personal quality. And once I've decided to do something, as my mother said, don't get in her way, she'll walk right over you. So this has been a lifelong struggle, love, and also journey, I should say.
So tell me about your first attempt. So what was the first thing you tried, and about, I guess, how old were you, or how long ago was it where you made your first attempt at learning Spanish, and how did that go?
Well, my first attempt at learning Spanish was in university. So I took 1 year. I was on scholarship, and I could take whatever classes I wanted to, basically outside of my major. And so I had some free time, and I needed extra credits. So I thought, oh, this is going to be a perfect time to take, a year of Spanish, which I did. And I mean, I got a very good foundation for the grammatical understanding of the language. But this is way, and I don't even want to tell you how many years ago it is, because probably before you were born. But this is really before the internet and all the other resources that we have now. And it was really, really difficult to learn a language unless you basically went to a Spanish-speaking country, or a country that was speaking your target language. So the first step was 1 year in university.
Yeah, and I think what you mentioned there, honestly, I don't think things changed a whole lot. I mean, I think now maybe they're a little bit better from what I've been seeing, but even when I was in school, I started in high school, and you have to pick a language, and I picked Spanish, but I think what you said still rings true. Like, yeah, it gives you a good understanding of grammar, which which is the same thing if we think about it. As a native English speaker, we learn English grammar in school because coming into an English class, you're already speaking English at home. So it's not like they're teaching you English, they're just teaching you how to format it properly in an academic setting, right? But I find the approach to foreign language to be similar, which is problematic because oftentimes the thing that we want to do is speak the language and communicate with people. And what we get is, here's how you conjugate a verb that ends in AR, and that usually leaves us unable to have conversation. So and I think a lot of people get discouraged that way as well, because you feel like you're failing at something. Even if you're getting like good grades in school, then the minute you go out and try to have a conversation, you're like, okay, this isn't working. I don't understand what they're saying, right? So you said you took Spanish in university, so I guess that was about a year or so, or did you continue taking it beyond that, like first
I
year?
took that in my senior year, and then it was like,
Okay.
again, this is way before all the technology and also the different mindset that young people have now, that if they just want to do something, they're going to go and do it and not worry about the cost of it. That, number one, wasn't the way I was raised, and number two, that was a different time. So it really took me about 10 years after that before I could save up enough money working to go to Mexico and study in a language school. So I actually had two different trips to Mexico to do that. And still, even after that experience, my cousins were falling off the seat laughing at me every time I said
Oh
anything.
no.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that. So you learned in school, so you had a bit of a foundation of grammar. So you had some basically familiarity with the language, and then, it took you a little while, and then you went to Mexico. So talk a little bit about those trips. Like, was it an immersion trip? Did you go to a language school? Tell me like a little
Yes, I
bit
did.
about your experience
Yes.
there,
Yes.
and how you felt about your Spanish coming through that experience, and did you make improvements, or how did you feel about it?
Yes. The first one was the Instituto Cultural in Oaxaca. And I booked the trip and didn't even know where Oaxaca was. I thought it was outside of Mexico City. Then I looked at the map after I bought the plane ticket and was kind of shocked. But that was, yeah, that was an amazing experience because I had family stays for both of those immersion experiences. And I think in Oaxaca, that really was where I was the most comfortable coming back here and most confident, even though my family cousins were still falling off those chairs laughing at me every time I said anything. So, that was in Oaxaca. And then a couple of years later, I went to the Bilingual Bicultural Institute in Cuernavaca, which really was one of the best educational experiences that I've ever had. And at that time, it really, I was really very much surprised that my Spanish was to a level where, of course, the classes are taught at that time, well, at my level, I should say, only in Spanish. And I was able to actually take notes in Spanish during the class. And this is like anthropology or legends or, history of Mexico. So, both experiences were just really invaluable, and also invaluable in increasing my confidence in speaking.
Right. Okay. So a year in college, 2 immersion trips to Mexico, starting to gain some confidence, having familiarity. And yet you go to speak to your family who's primarily from Cuba, and you said they're kind of, laughing at you, and
They weren't kind of laughing, trust me.
Well, talk about that, because that must be frustrating, because I know for me, right? So in school primarily as well, I think we learned Spanish, either from like Mexico or from Spain, right? Those are like the two, at least in the US, that they focus on. And we might learn, oh, there's a difference between, Spanish and Spain. They use vosotros, and, that's the only difference. And then like everything, like we're just taught, oh, there's these 2 words that are different. And then, but yeah, you could just speak the language, and Spanish is Spanish everywhere. But I also quickly learned when I started traveling that there are some very stark differences in the language that for someone learning the language is really difficult. For someone who's even a native speaker, it can be a little bit, take some time to navigate. But as someone who's learning the language, picking up on those nuances is almost impossible in the beginning, especially if you don't know. So talk about how you felt, going back to speak to your family. You had this confidence, and then you're talking to your cousins, and they're like, that's not
They cut me off at the knees. Yeah,
Okay.
They cut me off at the knees. It was awful. And I mean, it really diminished my confidence in speaking,
Yeah.
because I didn't know what the problem was. And I think that really, this is a kind of a failing in many Hispanic families, is that they don't realize how hard it is to learn, and how much time and how much money you spend trying to learn. And, if my family had been more supportive, it would have been a lot easier for me. But they just, laughed, basically. And, your family can be really cruel anyway, but it was very hurtful, and it really diminished my, I had all this confidence coming back from Mexico, and this just really, evaporated it. It just evaporated.
Wow. I really appreciate you mentioning that perspective, because I think for so many people, there is this fear that they're going to be laughed at. Like that's the fear that everyone has on why they don't speak Spanish. And the fact that you went through the point of getting that confidence, and really taking time, like you said, investing your time and your money, right, into really, attempting to learn the language for the purpose of connecting with your family. And then to have that reaction, I can only imagine how demoralizing that could be. But I think it's also interesting because, like you mentioned, there's something that happens with families that immigrate to other countries in general. But I think, in the US, I have noticed that there is this tendency where you have some families that want their children to only speak English, because they view it as not really necessarily assimilation, but more of, listen, I want you to be able to speak this language. I came here for a better life. I don't need you learning Spanish. I need you to be the one in the family that, is successful. So I'm making the sacrifice for you. So your English needs to be impeccable, and I don't need you speaking Spanish. And sometimes don't value, passing on that part of the culture, because the reason that you go through all of this upending your entire life is so that your children can have a better future. So sometimes, unfortunately, I think you're right that some families that are, that come here with their children do not emphasize, passing on the language and the culture in that way, and don't maybe realize how difficult that could be for the children. And I think also you bring up this point, and I'm glad you said it, because we often say, like, I'm always trying to tell people, no one's going to laugh at you. Trust me, it's going to be fine. Which I think is true for those of us who who don't have family members, right? That are, because people, when they see you from the outside and you're trying, they give you a lot more leeway than someone whose family, like you said, sometimes unfortunately people who are closest to us can be the cruelest, right? The people that hurt you the most are the people that are closest to you.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I think that there is a different dynamic there. So I'm so glad you brought that up because yeah, I mean, for someone that's an outsider, quote unquote, um, I think the worst that I've experienced is someone will just start speaking to me in English, and then I would take offense to that, like, oh, my Spanish
Mhm.
must be horrible,
Mhm.
because they clearly are like, okay, gringo, like let me help you out, like, and if they were bilingual, they would just kind of switch to English. So I used to take offense to that when I went to Puerto Rico. It happened to me quite a bit, but yeah, I mean, the fact that family, one, didn't prepare you, and two, basically mocked you at your attempts
Mhm.
to learn.
Mhm.
I guess, like you said, you really are persistent because here you are
Mhm.
still. So
Yes,
what,
many
tell
years
me,
later.
yeah, so
I'm sorry.
tell me then so take me back to that point. So you had spent this time in Mexico, you come back, you're talking to your family, they're laughing at you. And what was it, because your Spanish was more like Mexican because that's where you learned? Was it because it was just what was the reason for it, or do you even know? And then what did you do after?
Well, there's several different times that they've laughed over the years. Let's put it that way.
Oh
Um,
gosh.
yes. Oh, yeah. They can be cruel. They can be rough. They can be brutal. I came back, and obviously that wasn't. And as I said, my tenacity is my biggest, quality. So I connected with the university here, my local university, and asked if they had a Spanish-speaking student that wanted to do a language exchange.
Okay.
So I did that. And at the time, interestingly enough, I have a 30-year performance career in flamenco. And so a lot of the instructors who came from Spain obviously did not teach class in English, they taught in Spanish. So I understood enough that I was able to, to do well in the classes and not have any problems to ask questions if I needed to. But I didn't really speak a lot of Spanish with the other dancers because everybody used English because there were many people there that did not speak Spanish. So
Mhm.
I did that and the language exchange. And then through the language exchange, I met some other people who I became friends with, and they were Mexican. And so I really interacted with them a lot. And at that time, I was way before I got married. I started going out with, from that group, one of the friends' brothers-in-law, I think it was, and they were from Mexico, from Durango. And so his parents did not speak English. So I had to speak Spanish when I was with them. And again, my family's laughing because they asked me something. I say, Mande. And they're like, oh my God, you're so Mexican.
But you persevered, right,
Mhm.
through that. And so what was it, do you think, made the biggest difference for you, where you started to feel more comfortable? Was it that you were in environments with people where you were not necessarily forced to speak Spanish, but it just became easier to have more social interactions in Spanish?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. I really lost my confidence probably about 5 years ago, or a little bit more than 5 years ago in speaking. And I had even studied at a very well-known language school that's close to my home. They were very, very well known. And the instructor that I had was from Argentina. And it was a one-on-one. And I mean, I actually took inheritance money that I had to do the course. It was so expensive. And all she did
Wow.
was she told me how bad my Spanish was, how many mistakes I made. And it was very difficult to teach me because I made so many mistakes. And my response was, if I didn't make mistakes, I wouldn't need to be in the class here with you. I mean, really.
All right.
So I terminated that experience. And as I said, I kept looking for other um, venues to improve my Spanish and also improve my confidence. And I'm really not sure how I found Spanish con salsa, but Tamara, I really want to thank you for this because number one, there on the platform there are a multitude of classes and information, and it's so much that sometimes I think, oh my God, what am I going to do next? But everything is broken down so well, and being a part of the conversation club and also having the accountability partner really helped me amazingly. And since I was in the advanced conversation group, the goal was to do a 15-minute presentation in Spanish at the end of the course. And I had the language coaching with Hayel, and Hayel actually it suggested the conversation club to me. She said, well, that you can have the 15-minute presentation at the end of the class. And I was like, but that will really push me, make me even go further than I think I can go. And I think really Spanish con Salsa has really helped me, even with coworkers that I have who are Spanish speaking. Now I have two. One's from Chile and the other one's from Puerto Rico. And I noticed this about myself just this last week. I didn't have any problem asking how to say something. How do you say this? And then, yes, I work in a clinic, and I have many patients who are Spanish speaking. And many times we use the phone interpreter for any language. And usually and I've gotten better, I'll introduce myself in Spanish and say, I'm going to use the phone interpreter just because I don't want to make a mistake, but I will be here listening. And many times I've caught the interpreter not interpreting correctly.
Wow. Hey, it's Tamara Marie. I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. Really quickly, I just wanted to let you know about an opportunity for you to dramatically improve your Spanish coming up very, very soon. I know when I first started learning Spanish, it was really difficult for me to make consistent progress. I downloaded every resource I could find. I even took classes at a community college, but I found that I still was afraid and unable to carry on a conversation with a native speaker. That's why we started the Spanish Fluency Club. We provide community support, coaching, and regular conversation practice with a detailed plan and the feedback that you need to improve. You will gain the momentum and have the opportunity of speaking Spanish every week so that you're getting better and better, and you have those opportunities to continuously move forward. So if you're feeling stuck in your Spanish journey, if you don't have anyone to talk to in Spanish consistently, that will correct you kindly and give you the feedback that you need to improve your accent, to improve your pronunciation, to improve your vocabulary so that you sound more like a native speaker, I invite you to check out the Spanish Fluency Club. We will be opening doors very, very soon, and the only way to make sure that you are on the list to get notified when we open the doors, you have to be on our wait list. So please go to SpanishConsalsa.com/join. That's SpanishConsalsa.com/join to sign up for the waitlist for the Spanish Fluency Club. We will hook you up with a coach, with a community who is supportive so that you will never be lost and you know exactly what you need to do to improve your Spanish so that you finally get to fluency. So if you're interested in checking out the Spanish Fluency Club and all that we have to offer, go to SpanishConsalsa.com/join. Okay, now back to the episode. Something you just said is really key that, and this is also a part of having confidence in the language. So you mentioned having, a coworker from Chile and then one from Puerto Rico. So two very different types of Spanish to the point where there are words that are very, very different, right? In both countries, the accents can be different. And just having that awareness and being able to ask that, oh, how do you say this? Or what is this word? Because just because you don't know a word doesn't mean that your Spanish is insufficient in some way. And that's what I always try to tell people. It's like, you have to have that skill of how do you navigate when you don't understand something, because it is going to happen. And I think especially for people who are educated and used to being smart in other areas, that it can be very humbling when you're in a situation where you have to ask or where you don't know. And a lot of people, I think, have the tendency to try to play it off and pretend, like, oh, yeah. But they really don't. And that can lead to so many misunderstandings, right? Especially in a work environment, especially with coworkers, you don't want to have some lingering thing where you just like are nodding like, yeah, see, okay, right? Like you understood. And then they said something completely different and you didn't catch it. So I think it's so important for communication to be able to know when it's appropriate to just ask, for clarification, because it's so easy to sort of mix things up. And I think that a lot of us see it as, especially when you're learning the language, you want to be proficient. And it's almost like we want to do this performance of like, oh, I speak this perfect Spanish and I understood. But that's not the point. The point is to communicate with another human being. And even in whatever language, if there's a miscommunication, there's a problem. So I love that you said just like not being afraid to do that and realizing, having the confidence to realize that doesn't mean that, there's a ding against your Spanish skills. It's just like, oh, I need to ask this question so that we can have effective communication. So I think that's very important. One thing I did want to ask you, though, is so when you were kind of going through all these different experiences, you spent clearly a lot of time, effort, and resources into your Spanish. And you mentioned kind of during lockdown, looking for resources online. But when you started with Spanish con Salsa, where were you with your level of confidence and with speaking? Because you mentioned like maybe about 5 years ago you had kind of lost that confidence. So at the point when you joined, like where were you with that confidence, and how has that shifted since you've been a member?
I think my confidence still wasn't really great. Another thing I want to say about Spanish con Salsa, which is one of the many things that I think is amazing about this platform, is that I got from one of your class for members only about what to do when you don't understand. Is that obviously I'm a perfectionist. That is my goal. I want to be perfect in everything. But you said something, and it really stuck with me. There's never going to be a time that you're going to understand everything. That was kind of the aha moment for me. And that plus the fact that with the coaching classes, you have a plan. You actually have a plan with attainable goals. Why is this important to me? Because number one, I need a goal. And number two, I work as a trainer. I'm a preceptor in a clinic. And I have very small goals for the people that I train. I've been training for 7 years, and we scaffold everything onto what we've learned before because we do procedures in my department. So I build their confidence with very small things. But just that idea of having the goal, and then with the language coaching sessions initially, that to receive the recordings of the coaching session. And you know what? I'll tell you, Tamara, after my first session with Hayel, I listened to my recording, and I was like, gosh, my Spanish really isn't too bad.
Yes. Yeah.
So, I mean, all of these things are there's a mountain of resources on Spanish con Salsa that I really didn't even understand until Hayel kept saying, well, why don't you look here? Why don't you look there? It's like, is that there really? And for the price that you pay, it's an immense offering of information and resource.
I'm so glad you mentioned just that you actually watched the recording and were able to see and actually just look at like, oh, actually I did pretty good. And I think as a recovering perfectionist myself, I definitely understand, right? Because in the moment when you're stuck, like when you're in that conversation and you're like, I can't think of the word, or did I say that right? You're questioning yourself, and it feels very much like you're stumbling through. But when you actually go and look back at it, reflect, and you go, wait, she understood me. I understood that. The conversation is actually flowing, and maybe only once or twice did I get tripped up. But when you're in it, it feels like an infinity of time that you're fumbling through.
Right.
And for someone, like I said, that's used to sort of, being able to navigate things just because of like your tenacity and just, your aptitude for things and just being on top of things in general in life, that can be a very, very unsettling and uncomfortable experience. So I'm so glad that you actually did that, because as many times as I'll tell people over and over again, here's the recording, watch the recording, take notes, look at what happened, review so that you can hear again, because repetition is so important. Take notes on the words that were new for you that came up. Which did you learn? Practice the things you didn't do correctly. Because that part of it is so valuable, but so many people don't do it. They'll just show up to a session and then they'll go, oh, I didn't have time to do anything this week. And then, they're not getting the full benefit because they're not doing it. So I'm just so glad that you're listening and doing those things and seeing the benefit. Because as much as, we and the coaches on the team try to tell everyone that, until you actually do it, it's really, really hard to see. So I'm hoping even some of our current members will listen to this and say, oh, all right, maybe I'll actually go back and do it now, because I can see that, that actually is a very important part to learning, is that review, and also being able to look at yourself a little bit more objectively, and go, you know what, I'm doing okay, or I noticed I keep making this mistake. I'm so glad that you found that benefit, and that has helped you continue to build your confidence. So what would you say? I mean, you mentioned there's a lot of resources at Spanish con Salsa, and we do really try to make sure we have everything that you need, so it's a one-stop shop. Because I know, especially now, we've got like AI, and there's ChatGPT, and there's all these YouTube videos. There's like so many resources that I think now the issue is that people just get drowned in the sheer amount of stuff you could do. And being able to direct and focus and make progress is actually harder in this environment. So what would you say is the biggest benefit that you've had from this process of just being, going through the language coaching process, and also your participation in the Fluency Club? What would you say is the biggest difference, and about how long did it take you to really kind of see an improvement?
Well, I think that the goal setting is crucial. And it's also crucial to have the accountability partner. I was on italki for 4 years, and I had really good instructors there, but their classes were their classes. And when I asked to do something different, they really didn't want to vary from their classes because I know that would mean more work for them. And that just wasn't available on that platform. But to be able to have someone, one of my goals is very simple, to order comfortably in the restaurant and to say, give me a change for this bill, give me a change for that bill, and keep the change.
As long as you're able to accomplish your goals and, continue to make progress and communicate with people effectively, you're winning. It's not about, becoming this perfect, dictionary for Spanish and English and never making a mistake. It's about, what is my goal? What do I want to do? And, can I make steps towards that? So I guess the last question I want to ask you before I ask you a few questions in Spanish is, going through all this and coming through the process with Spanish con Salsa, and how is your relationship now with your family in terms of your Spanish? Have you given up on them, or are you still trying?
I've kind of given up at this point, but something that's really important, because this is Spanish con Salsa and they do focus on Caribbean Spanish. The boot camp this summer was Cuban Spanish, and even though I wasn't able to attend the classes, I was able to, access the course. And I will tell you that I finally understood something that my aunt was saying when I was 17 years old, which is a whole lot of years ago. Because of that, I mean, it was just like I just couldn't understand what the heck is she talking about, because what I understood in Spanish was like not what she was saying, definitely. And it was like I finally understood after decades long, some things that I had heard in my family. I have a pretty good memory. And it's like, oh my God, that's what they were saying. And it took me all this time to, realize it. Because if you have a traditional learning path in Spanish in a university or a high school, they don't teach you, as you said in the beginning, Spanish that you can use on the street. But you have that, that 21-day course of fluency or phrases that are more real world. And then also in the conversation club, the dialogues with Spanish that you can actually use that makes you sound more like a native speaker. So that, if you're not in your family who speaks Spanish, that they don't switch to English when you're talking. Or if you're like me in a Spanish-speaking family where they're falling off the chairs laughing because you sound like a textbook. You sound like a textbook. You need to come down to the real people.
Well, I'm glad that's been helpful too, because yes, that's definitely a push, is that learning just for the sake of learning is great, but we don't necessarily focus on, passing like a test or something like that. In Spanish con Salsa, the idea is that you learn the culture, you learn the language, you learn the people and the way people actually speak, whether or not, it's textbook correct or it's the Queen's Spanish or whatever it is. That for us, it's important that you can communicate with people and understand people. And a lot of things get lost in translation. Like you said, this idea of like spending all this time and resources and sounding like a textbook is, it's so unhelpful in my opinion. And like I said, if your goal is to pass a test, fine, go for it, right? You get flying colors, you'll be anointed with level, C1 advanced Spanish, and you still can't have a conversation. But but yeah, because that was sort of my experience too. Like I was like, oh, I'm acing these like online quizzes, and then I still can't talk to someone. So so yeah, I'm glad that you found that useful, because that is something that's really important to us, is making sure that you can actually use what you're learning in some way and immediately, right? Not like, oh, it's going to take you 6 months before you can now go. It's like, no, all right, what do we learn in this lesson, this conversation, and what can you use in your next conversation? Right. And so that is very, very important, because that's also the way that you get better. I say you get fluent sort of like one word, one phrase, one conversation at a time, one context at a time, one subject matter at a time. Because I'm pretty sure your profession, there's things I don't even understand in English, let alone Spanish. Right. So we all kind of have to master what's important to us in the context that we live in, and not the sort of fictional, textbook person who's always, the guy going to a Spanish speaking country at a bar and asking the girl to buy her a cerveza. Like that is not most of our experience, but that's where all the courses start, right? It's like, you're at a business trip and you want to get Maria a cerveza. I'm like, seriously? So So Cynthia, I'm so glad. I wanted to thank you for taking the time to join me on the podcast and for sharing your story. And I know this will help so many people who are, maybe struggling as well to learn Spanish. I hope your tenacity rubs off on anyone who's listening to this, that regardless of where you are, that you just don't give up. And you'll get to that point where, you know, you can be comfortable speaking the language and it'll seem like, oh, was I ever a person that couldn't speak Spanish, right? So thank you so much for sharing your experience. And before we wrap up, do you mind if I ask you a few questions in Espanol?
Oh, no. Vaya.
Okay. Entonces, Cynthia, ¿cuál es tu palabra o frase favorita en español?
No creo que tenga una favorita. A mí me gusta mucho la palabra corazón o tierno, porque siempre lo digo a mi esposo, ay, mi esposo tierno, es muy simpático. Pero no tengo una favorita frase, ni un dicho.
¿Tienes una canción favorita en español?
Claro que sí. Para mí es La vida es carnaval, hecho por Celia Cruz.
Ah,
Y
sí,
también, sí. Y también mi música favorita, flamenca. A mí me encantan las sevillanas, las voces.
Flamenca es algo nuevo para mí. Normalmente no escucho mucho flamenco, pero creo que un poquito de tango, porque yo fui a Argentina, pero con flamenco no. Yo fui a España una vez y traté de ir a una clase de flamenco, pero estaba en otro día y tuve que pasar por otra parte del país, entonces no asistí, pero interesante el
Muy
flamenco.
interesante. Sí.
Para mí es muy bonito, pero yo prefiero la bachata y la salsa, la verdad.
Es muy, muy difícil. Es muy, muy difícil.
Sí. Entonces necesito clases de ti, de flamenco. La última pregunta. Si no tuvieras que trabajar, ¿qué harías con el tiempo adicional?
Bueno, pues si no tuviera que trabajar, aprendería más idiomas, no solamente español, sino francés, y también mi esposo es filipino y me gustaría aprender muchas más palabras y frases en su idioma Tagalog. Hay palabras españolas en Tagalog, pero es un idioma muy, muy diferente y muy difícil. Más idiomas.
Sí, sí. Sí, yo también. Mi hijo está aprendiendo japonés.
Wow.
Y para mí es tan difícil porque tienen 3 alfabetos diferentes, distintos, ¿no? Y yo quiero también aprender un poquito de japonés y solamente por él. Y también árabe. Árabe es un idioma que yo quiero aprender árabe Egipto porque yo quiero ir allí. Pero en este momento es como, cada vez que quiero ir a esta parte del mundo, hay alguna guerra o algo así. Entonces es como,
Sí,
yo no
entiendo.
sé, yo no puedo ir ahora, pero en el futuro yo no sé. Pero sí. Entonces, muchísimas gracias, Cynthia. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. And just before you go, is there anything that you would say to someone who might be struggling with learning Spanish right now, or is maybe thinking about maybe joining Spanish con Salsa? What would you say to them?
Spanish con Salsa will give you a coach and a map. And that's important because I spent many years without having a coach and a map. Had good instructors, but no real map to reach my goal and to make your goal something small in the beginning, as Tamara always says. Make it, I want to order in the restaurant. It's invaluable having a coach that can help you plan out a goal and also how to reach it.
As long as you don't give up, you haven't failed, you know.
Right.
And I think you are such a great example of that. And I'm so glad to see how you continue to improve. And I would love to see you doing more with Cuban Spanish and, I just want to see your family members one day look at you and go, whoa, is that like because she knows more than we do. I just kind of want that for you. I want to see that. So I would love to see you do more with that. I will continue to do more of Cuban Spanish in the future as well.
Okay,
So,
great.
but thank you so much for taking the time to join me on the podcast. Que tengas un buen día.
Gracias a ti también.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Cynthia. And I'm really grateful to her for sharing her experience because I couldn't imagine just going through all of the trouble that she went through, all of the time and resources that she put into wanting to connect with her family, only to find that they were not super receptive to her. And I know that, a lot of times, like I said in a conversation with her, that, our fear that we're going to be laughed at, that really is our biggest fear. And the fact that that happened to her shows that even if you think that that is going to be the response to people when you start speaking Spanish, that you can overcome it. And part of overcoming it is finding a supportive community and people that you can speak Spanish with that will not laugh at you. I can't even imagine going through that. But like she said, family is family, and everyone, I'm sure you have your own stories about your family members, some of them who may not be your favorites. And unfortunately for Cynthia, those were her family members that spoke Spanish. But for you, you probably won't have that experience. And if you connect with a community like Spanish Con Salsa, where we have native speakers who are from different countries, especially Spanish speakers from the Caribbean, which are some of the most popular destinations. They're some of the places where a lot of people are from that may move to different countries. And so it's going to be very valuable to get that experience of having conversations with people from Puerto Rico, from Dominican Republic, from Cuba, from Central America, and not just from Spain or Mexico. So if you're looking for a supportive community that will give you real feedback to see how you're doing in speaking Spanish, and also help you gain that confidence that you need to be able to learn the language and be able to speak it fluently, then I encourage you to consider joining the Spanish Fluent Salsa community very shortly here. If you're listening to this podcast in August or September 2024, we will be opening the doors to our Spanish Fluency Club. We will have a new round of group cohorts that will be starting very, very shortly. So you can go to SpanishFluentSalsa.com/join if you would like to be a part of our membership. So I definitely encourage you that if this is something that you have thought about in the past, but you just haven't taken the leap, right? And you haven't really just decided to see what it's all about, then I definitely encourage you to check us out. If you're listening to this after August or September 2024, no worries. You can still go to our website, SpanishConsalsa.com/join, and you will be able to join our wait list. So we will be opening up doors, like I said, very shortly here. So make sure you sign up for our waiting list, SpanishConsalsa.com/join. And just check it out. See what it's all about. See if this might be the thing that you need to get your Spanish to the next level. So as always, I hope that something you heard on today's podcast has taken you one step closer from Spanish beginner to bilingual. Hasta la próxima.
Thank you for listening to the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast at learnspanishconsalsa.com.